Kris, my good friend, it is so lovely to be able to have a chat. I have nothing but love and admiration for you. And even though we, you know, have lived in different places, we've managed to continue to communicate here and there from either across the world or interstate. I just want to, well, maybe just to start with, could you just give the 100-word bio, the snapshot on who Kris is and what he does?
Sure. Well, firstly, I think this could be called the Mutual Admiration Society, because I have nothing but love and admiration for you two, real small. Really cherish and appreciate the friendship and the continued connection. So yeah, my name is Kris. Obviously, I'm a Salvation Army officer, so a minister. I've been in this role for 10 years. And before that was employed full-time in ministry here in Melbourne with the Salvation Army for about 6 years before that. I've been involved in one way or another with the Salvation Army since I was about 13 or 14. So this is a long-term thing for me. I'm currently involved in mission in the inner city in Melbourne, so in Richmond and in Brunswick. So really heavy, low socioeconomic area, particularly in Richmond, a housing estate, a few thousand of the poorest people in Australia, right in the heart of our church. So that's where the current mission field is. I'm also gay, and so that's something I'm quite passionate about too. Not being gay, but actually working to make sure that we have a really inclusive model of church and community in my local context, but also in the Salvation Army. So as part of my overall work or life, I get to spend time with some people involved with the Salvation Army around the world who are on this same path of actually trying to resource and equip and provide platform to raise up voices and create dialogue for people to really dream. What does it look like to be a fully inclusive, equitable church where all people, regardless of who they're in love with, can find full life and full service in Jesus?
Such good and important work. And yeah, we'll go into it a little bit more, but you know, I'm just so inspired by anyone like yourself doing that work. I want to ask you, you know, in my little crew and kind of church tribe, we talk about being spiritual misfits, which can cover a whole range of experiences. But is that a term that resonates with you? Would you identify as a spiritual misfit? And if so, what does that kind of bring up for you?
Look, I'm owning it, Will. I haven't really thought of labeling in that way before, but absolutely, I'm loving it. I'm claiming it. And to be honest, I would say that by default, that's probably how I would identify, because so many people over 25 years now of Christian life and participation in the church have labelled me as an outsider, or someone who doesn't belong, or someone who doesn't fit. And so by very virtue of what others perceive me to be in the threat that someone like me is perceived to be, just by purely being myself, I guess means that I am definitely a misfit. So I'm owning it, I'm claiming it. I'm saying, you know what, let's bring all of those misfits together and let them know that they're all loved and all worth and all created in the image of God.
And I love that we can take a term that could be negative and own it as a badge of honor, because I think that, you know, the Church of Jesus should be the ultimate misfits club, right? Like,
yeah,
they were the ones he hung out with. So I'm happy to be.
It's where it all began. And you know, the thing we've got to also keep in mind is that it was the misfits, it was the radicals, it was the people on the edge that Jesus reached out to and spent time with, and they were the ones who loved him. They were the ones who followed him. They were the ones who sought to live like him. And so he reached out and loved them. They reached back and loved him back. And so actually it's right there on the edges, right there on the margins, right there in those places where the people gather that aren't included and accepted in mainstream faith community. That's where Jesus was. And
still is, I would argue, for sure.
Absolutely.
So could you share, I know it's probably a long story, and probably a lot of very difficult stuff to unpack. So don't go beyond what you feel comfortable sharing, but could you give some snapshots of what the journey has been like of coming out while being a Salvation Army minister?
Yeah, I think the first place to start would be to go back a little bit far. I'm not going to hang out there, don't worry. But I actually first felt really called to be Salvation Army officer when I was about 14 years old. In fact, as we've all reflected on the very sad passing of Bert Newton this week, I was looking back on some footage of myself as a 14-year-old on Bert's New Faces doing stand-up comedy, and Bert introduced me as someone who wanted to be a children's TV show host or a Salvation Army officer when he grew up. Wow. So right back from then, I had this really clear call. Now, I hadn't grown up in the church at all. In fact, my parents didn't want me involved in church. They had some quite bad experiences. Found my own way to the Salvation Army, found out quite by default that actually my family history was in the Salvation Army. It had skipped a generation, so I guess I'd sort of come back. And all of a sudden, a whole lot of stuff made sense. And I really felt from that time, 14, 15, 16, this is where I was going to spend the rest of my life. Obviously, a little bit later on, I started to just explore who I was. Now, I'm a little bit older than you, Will, and so things weren't quite so easy. Not to suggest they're easy now, because they're absolutely not, and people still struggle with the coming out experience and with bullying. But things were particularly tough back in the 90s in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, and so I've spent a lot of years pushing back against the threats and claims of the bullies, and it wasn't until I kind of left school that I was able to stop and reflect. Actually, there is something in this, and maybe I am different. Maybe I am not like these other guys at Epping High. So with that exploration came a real tension, because I'd been brought up in the Salvation Army teaching, which was really clear at that point. The material we used to train young people then said that this was an abomination and that not godly for people to be same-sex attracted, and something that had to be suppressed and repressed. So I was pretty honest at that time. I remember I was on the pathway to being accepted to be a Salvation Army officer, and the question came up. Now, I think I was 18 or 19 at this point, 100% sure of this calling to be an officer or a minister, still working through the sexuality stuff. And so I said, I was asked, are you gay? And I said, look, I think I might be, still working this through. And the person doing the interview said, you will never, ever be a Salvation Army officer. There is no room in the Salvation Army for someone like you. And so that was devastating. That was a real body blow. I'd been through a whole bunch of stuff until that point. So there was, I'd left school at 15, left home at 15. There was obviously a whole lot of complex things going on. And what held me was the faith I had in Christ. What held me was the belonging I had in Christian community. And what held me was this idea that actually I was called to something else and had life planned out for me. And then that was pulled away. So I had a few years in the wilderness, but they were fantastic years. So really then began to explore, what does it look like for me to be open, whole, honest as a young gay man? So, there was the parties and the new friendship groups and the celebrations. And of course, there were the excesses that come with that. That's all part of the exploration process. And when you've been cut free from your safe space, cut free from your community, told that you don't belong as you are, well, of course, you go to where you do belong and you're free from all of the binds that held you back. So when you tell a 19-year-old, well, you're no longer part of this community and all of the sort of those things that have held you in, Salvos don't drink and they don't smoke and they don't have sex and all that stuff. Well, all of a sudden, none of those rules applied to me anymore. And so I jumped right in and explored all of those things. Now, I'm not proud of those days, and they obviously sure had effects long term, but that's where you end up. And then found myself a few years later, so about 2003, had a really significant spiritual experience actually, where I felt and heard very clearly for the first time the voice of God calling me back. God said quite clearly, I know you, I love you, I'm sorry for what's happened, it's time to come back. And that was on the shores of Surfers Paradise Beach at about 1 o'clock in the morning on the Gold Coast.
Wow.
And I just felt this really incredible, warm, enveloping love of God, and buoyed by the Spirit, and came back and sought out my old officers and the church I used to go to, and the rest, as they say, is history. Started the process again. Now, I remember actually I started volunteering the Salvation Army then in 2003, started working a little bit later, and actually felt the call to apply for officership again. And I remember praying really deeply, there's got to be another way. I said, this literally nearly killed me last time. I can't go through that again. It just felt this really strong urge to push on and apply again. So I did do that, and here we are.
Wow, what a story. And it's interesting to me that you did leave in a sense, or got kicked out really, and came back. That's interesting in itself. But that's really in terms of an organization, an institution. I want to know, I guess, did you ever think about just chucking the whole thing? Did you ever have moments where you thought, Jesus, faith, God, church, all of it, should I just leave that behind? And if not, why not?
Absolutely, I did. There's no question about that. So in that early time, none of it made sense, and it was Christian community that had caused this hurt and this damage. And so you do connect in your mind the Christian community and Christ. It's just the way it is, and it is particularly hard to find Christian fellowship when you're not a part of a community. And so one particularly challenging aspect of that too is that in the queer community, those who are LGBTQIA, there's so much hurt that's been caused by the church in that context. And it's, there's some great statistics out there that talk about how many LGBTQI people are Christian and still remain so, but have been burnt by the church. And so it's actually really hard to find safe space in that community as a Christian, as equally it is to find safe space in the church as a gay person, in my case. So that was tough. So you do end up pushing right away. It was probably about 2 years before I started to really develop prayer again. But everywhere I went, I still carried my Bible. I still read it. I was still interested. I guess there were occasional prayers. There was still a sense of God's presence, but I just couldn't dig in because there was so much hurt and pain and rejection that came with what all of that meant.
Wow. Kris, when I first met you, I actually remember thinking, I heard you pray. I heard you talk about God as your father. And I felt like Kris loves God and experiences God's love more than I do. And just that sense of, for all of the categories and boxes I grew up with around the so-called paradox or contradiction of being a gay Christian, I was like, this is living proof that I tick all of the right boxes on paper, but I feel like I'm with someone who seems to have a more intimate connection with Christ than I do.
What's quite challenging about this, actually. I mean, I don't know that my connection with Christ, I like to think it's deep. I like to think that I do know God as a father. And that was a really significant part of that early connection back in 2003 on the beach, that I didn't really have strong father figures in my life. And to hear God say, I'm your father, put a whole lot in perspective for me. And that stayed with me to this point. And so I do find a really good connection in that way, particularly when I'm praying. But that's what's really hard, is because you're told so often that you are wrong and deranged and an abomination, and there is something wrong with you, and you can't possibly be a Christian, you can't possibly be this way. But I know I've got a deep relationship with God. I literally hear from God, as do many of my friends. I share with him, he shares with me. I see Christ in the people I meet on the streets in Richmond. I hear from him when I'm reflecting on what to do when a person comes in need. There is a real depth of relationship there, and it's really tough because that's questioned in a situation like this. That is questioned all of the time. I remember when I was in the Salvation Army Training College, which were 2 of the worst years of my life, having to live with 40 conservative Christians for 2 years can almost push you over the edge, and almost did. I did look at leaving halfway through because I realized it was not good for my mental health, actually, or spiritual health or physical health to be there. I was sitting in a theology class and I could hear someone crying behind me, and I turned around, and one of my classmates was just literally in tears. And I said to him, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Oh, it's just, my heart's breaking. I love you like a brother, and I hate the idea that you're going to spend eternity in hell."
Oh my goodness.
And so that that stuff really rocks you. How do you explain to someone like that? And why should you have to explain to someone like that that actually you have a deep, meaningful relationship with Christ? I'm absolutely not spending eternity in hell, and people like me absolutely aren't spending eternity in hell.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, I just acknowledge the atrocious things that you have endured that you should never have had to endure, and apologize, for what it's, I can't apologize on behalf of everyone, but I feel the grief, the sadness, and know that at times in my life I participated in that, and I repent of that continuously. But it's so obvious, Kris, that you abide in the love, and don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. I've experienced it. I've sat with you and felt it. And, for everyone that questions that, there needs to be that deep affirmation and validation, not just in your mind. Like, I see it, and it's very real. And it ministers to me.
We appreciate that. Look, I wonder if if that sort of thing is challenging to people, because you do challenge paradigms. And one of the big, if there's one takeaway I have for people who are looking at relationships they have with gender or sexuality diverse people, a key point for me is saying that something's being said in love doesn't make it said in love, and doesn't stop the hurt. Saying something in a Christian context doesn't help you numb the pain. And I'm not sure what it is about particularly conservative evangelical people in our society that they've been maybe taught, I'm not sure, that if your belief is based on your particular understanding of the Bible, then it can't possibly hurt anybody else, and you're doing them a favor by bringing that up. And so, I've had that all of my life, Christians telling me, asking me what the generational sin was that led me to this place, and whether I was abused as a child, and how I can get right with God. But even quite recently, so I was a part of, actually we were together, part of a leadership development group over a couple of years, almost 2 years we spent back and forward, spending time in residentials together. And that I would say, second to the Salvation Army Training College, that was the second most horrifying 2 years of my life. Should have been a time of great connection, and we kept being told, share openly, share deeply. And so I did, because I thought, this is great. It's very rare in Christian community and in leadership, and as a gay person speaking for myself, that you have safe space. And all of a sudden we were told, here we are. We were literally sitting in a circle. This is a safe space, share openly. And what I learned the really hard way was it wasn't a safe space. And things I shared were fed back to people's churches and denominations. And after sharing some of the struggles that I was going through, when we met, I think the first time we met was the week of the marriage equality vote. So it was actually a really significant time. So we're asked, what's significant happening in your life right now? Well, for me, that was significant, because it meant that people like me all of a sudden have the opportunity to get married. There's the possibility that we find the right person and fall in love. If this goes our way, we could really get married. But more than that, it meant that young people were going to hear one way or the other whether the rest of society thought that they were okay. People were going to grow up knowing that actually their relationships are valid in society or not. People in the church were going to now be teaching with affirmed view from the government and society that the gay people are wrong or not. Anyway, so I shared some of that, and got a phone call a couple of weeks later from one of the leaders of the group saying how bad it was that I shared, and that I upset the other men in the group particularly, and that the board has had a lot of trouble dealing with how to deal with me and what to do with this bad behaviour, and that I wasn't to share anymore. They threatened to kick me out of the program. So they said they had discussed whether or not I should be able to continue in the program, but they said very graciously allowing me the opportunity to continue the program if I just agreed to not speak up anymore on this issue, because it was so upsetting to the conservative members, particularly those from Sydney, where they have a more conservative upbringing, where and that people don't come to a group like that to be challenged, and so I needed to refrain. So I actually really struggled. great group, and you ask yourself, why do I stick it out in this sort of context? Why am I doing this? There was opportunities available. I'm about to finish my master's, which came with that course. I had met a couple of friends there, including yourself. I wasn't going to give that up. I wasn't going to let these people push me out. I wasn't going to let them tell me that my belonging at this table wasn't as valid as everybody else's. I'd been nominated because of who I was and because of where I'd come from and what I had to offer the kingdom. I'd been invited to this table with other emerging leaders around the country, and all of a sudden I was being told, because of one aspect of me, I'm no longer able to be at this table. Sort of bugger that. I belong here. So I stuck it out, but really struggled to share, because when you're told you have to start filtering, and this is the other thing to keep in mind, when you're told you need to start filtering, you don't know what to offer anymore. And this is what causes a lot of tension for people who are gender or sexuality diverse, is you want to come whole. You want to come authentic. You want to come as your true self. But you know that if you open your mouth and share that I am gay, or there's a vote happening this week that is significant for me, or I think I've met someone I'm in love with, if you're told to put the shutters up, you don't get to control those shutters. Emotionally, mentally, we don't get to control what shutters come up and down when we start putting blockages like that in place. And so when you come to a table where you're told, please share openly, but there are going to be restrictions on what you can share, your brain automatically blocks a whole lot of stuff off. And you end up building 2 or 3 separate identities. And that's really damaging for a lot of, gender and sexuality diverse people. You end up not coming as your true self because you're trying to be different people in different contexts. And that happened to me in this group. So I remember really struggling. The next time we came back, I just couldn't share. And actually I left the room because I didn't have anything to share openly. I didn't know that I could trust this space. I knew I couldn't. I didn't know where the boundaries were going to be. So I just sort of calmly walked out and went to the bathroom. And then I got reprimanded from that and being threatened to remove from the program again because I wasn't sharing, which was tough, but not as tough as at the end of the week when one of the other participants in the program said that they were going to put in a formal complaint because I was using the communal bathrooms and that I shouldn't be welcome in the men's bathroom.
Oh my goodness.
So he was wanting to sort of petition the organisers to make sure I had a room with my own bathroom so I wouldn't have to share with the other men, because that wasn't appropriate. That's the stuff that gets you. It was set in love, it was, born out of his Christian belief, but that stuff rocks you. And I think we tell ourselves sometimes that because we're saying it based on our biblical understanding, it's not going to hurt. But I assure you it's devastating.
It's horrible. I'm so sorry, Kris. I mean,
it wasn't you, Will.
It wasn't me. I'm glad it wasn't me. But I'm disgusted. I'm disgusted that happened. And it's really important to hear that. It's really important for me and for others to hear that and to sit with the weight of that and to do everything we can to ensure that other people don't have that experience. And tragically, they are at the moment, I'm sure. But I really, I guess I'm thinking it seems like it would be so fair and valid. And I'm sure there are some people that would be absolutely urging you just to leave all of that behind. And it would be incredibly understandable. And it is understandable when people just go, I'm done with that. And I'm not even going to put myself in those spaces because of the potential harm. And yet you are someone who continues to advocate for change from within. You are wearing your officer uniform right there. You stuck out that course. You demanded a place at that table. And I really respect that. I wouldn't force anyone to do that. But I think the sense of, no, I'm like, in the same way as any other form of discrimination, I can sit anywhere I want on the bus.
Yeah.
I deserve to be in the room. I'll
use whichever bathroom I please.
Exactly. When you think about it as analogous to those other historical things that we just think are ludicrous and disgusting, I'm sure that this is the same. And we will look back with great shame when we, realize that and see what was normative for a time. But I want to ask you, Kris, what like for anyone who's watching this and they're like, why the heck has Kris not just left? You know, why continue to advocate for change from within when it's so exhausting, so painful, potentially costs you so much?
I can assure you, you'd be joining the ranks of my closest friends and family and many people that I meet that ask that same question. And I'll be damned if I'm getting pushed away from my calling. God called me to this place, to this church, to this ministry. It's what makes sense. And I went looking for other things that made sense. I was, doing youth work for a time, and I worked in disability care, and I did some training in promotions and marketing and all the stuff that actually ticks boxes for me in terms of what I enjoy in ministry. And something just didn't make sense, because do you know what? This is what I was created for. This is my church. This is my role. This is my calling. And I've been called, as many thousands of people in the Salvation Army and the broader church have through history, have been called from the margins to the front lines of the mission field. That's in our DNA. And no one's taking that from me. They've tried many times. I'm not being told that I'm not worthy of a place at an emerging leaders gathering because my views or my pure presence may upset others. Absolutely not. Why should I give up that opportunity? Why should I miss out on that opportunity for friendships such as this one, or for study, or for equipping? Absolutely not. I'm not going to hide myself and deny myself because my presence upsets other people. It was told to me when I was finally accepted to be a Salvation Army officer, the person at that panel, which was a few years after the first time, was really struggling. And he said, my biggest concern is if we accept you, there'll be a split in the Salvation Army like there was in the worldwide Anglican Church. I had to say to him, look, Major, I don't know who you think I am, but I'm not the king of the gays. I don't have this sort of power. But that just, like, there's so much burden placed on people in this situation. And so I think it's expected that we'll buckle under that. But I say absolutely not. And no one's taking my calling from me, because I know what it feels like to live outside of your calling. I know what it feels like to live outside of the rhythm of God. And sure, I could find that in other ways, and sure, I could be ministering in other ways and participating in other ways. But actually, this particular thing is what I was called to. And I'm absolutely sure, when I look at the history of the Salvation Army, when I look at the history of the church, when I look deep in the Gospels, don't even have to look deep, but when you look at the Gospels and see who Jesus was called to and who he hung out with and what he did for those people who were otherwise excluded, I am sure that that's what I'm called to and what our church is called to, and particularly what the Salvation Army is called to. I've lost a lot of friends, and I will say it's quite challenging, because I've lost a lot of good allies, heterosexual, cisgendered people who can't stand by the Salvation Army's position on sexuality and same-sex relationships, and so they leave. That's really challenging to think, okay, my friends are leaving. Shouldn't I be leaving too? I feel like a bit of a traitor or a hypocrite. But again, this is where I belong. And I'm sure that at its very best and its most inclusive, when everybody's welcome and everybody has equity and everybody has a place at the table and everybody can be whoever it is that God is calling them to be in our particular branch of the church, I'm sure our movement is going to be better for it. And I'm sure we're going to see lives transformed like never before. And we do. I've been to Salvation Army churches in Amsterdam and here in Melbourne City and around Australia. I've seen those places where everybody is welcome and everybody's included as they are, and they are thriving. They are bucking the trend of the church in the global north, and they are growing and they are thriving because they're including people as they are and allowing people to serve and worship as they are without having to hide, without having to compartmentalize. Of course, when people come fully whole, fully themselves, fully authentic, of course, they have a better interaction with God there. And of course, God blesses them and the church through that authenticity. We know this. It's quite obvious, but that's what happens. So I'm not leaving. I'm not losing my place at the table. I'm not going to stop taking opportunities, and I'm absolutely going to fight till the very end to make sure that everything I do is geared towards making sure that everybody's welcome at the table.
I love it, Kris. And I love it.
Sorry, that was a really long answer.
Well, you have the right to that long answer. That was fire. That was the best sermon I've heard preached in years. So do not apologize for it. Yeah, man. Like, I just think as well, like every time somebody feels forced to leave or leaves for very good reasons, it's like the people that have hijacked the story get to win. They get to
Yep,
tell it. And I don't,
absolutely.
I am, again, I wouldn't expect of anybody that they would put themselves in that position that can be so difficult and exhausting. But I also think we, you know, how come they get to own the story? That it
Yep,
doesn't work like that. Um, we get the right to have a say in what the Jesus story is about, just as much as
absolutely.
anybody else.
And I just want to be really clear on that too. It is hard. And so I'm not saying that everybody should stick around if they're being abused or if they're being oppressed.
Mm,
It's hard. It comes with a real life cost. And I've seen colleagues truly burn out as a result. So if it's too much, you've got to step aside and you've got to seek support and you've got to find others, of course. But if you're able to stick it out, exactly as you say, no one can take away our calling, no one can take away our covenant, and no one else gets to own our story.
mm. Yeah, for sure. Um, we'll wrap this up in a moment, but I wanted to ask, you've named some really heavy realities that we need to listen to deeply. I believe people like me, but anybody listening needs to listen deeply, wherever they sit on their theological spectrum or whatever. But I do see in what you're doing great signs of hope and encouragement and life and beauty. And I'm just wondering if you would want to share a little bit about some of the things that you're a part of, included other initiatives that are bringing hope to people that need to hear that side of the story as well to continue to hang on.
Yeah, look, the included movement's something that came as quite a surprise, and it's actually great to have you sharing with us in our upcoming event. Really a collection of people connected with the Salvation Army across the world. We're having the same conversations in our local context. How can we be more inclusive? How do we get resources? The Salvation Army's been on a path towards dialogue and exploration for a few years, but nobody's been able to find any dialogue or material to explore. So a few of us thought we've actually got to do this ourselves. And this isn't a protest group. It's not a breakaway movement. It's actually just a group of people who are trying to provide the platform to equip, to raise up the voices of the marginalised, to provide resources that are going to help people in their local church context and in their mission field and in their life, to connect and engage and work towards a more inclusive, equitable church. So we have a website, which is includedpage.com. It obviously has a Salvation Army bent, but it's open to everybody. People of all Christian denominations will find stuff there. There's great testimonies, there's incredible research, there's videos from previous gatherings that we've had. This coming event is called Included 2021. It's running across all time zones, and that'll be on YouTube for people to look at through the website. People, really renowned theologians and historians and people who have been leading the charge on things like conversion therapy and bridging the gap between the trans community and the church. People with deep biblical knowledge are coming to the table to help us understand. So this is for allies, this is for gender or sexuality diverse people. It's for people who are just asking the questions and want to hear something that will help them make sense of where we are today and how we can possibly dream and imagine a better church, a more inclusive church. So I'm loving watching that take off. It's been 12 months since we started with our first event, and we're now seeing hundreds of people around the world come together and participate in these events and access the resources to make their church more inclusive and safe space. And that's really the key. If I can finish on that one thing, Will, I think this is uncomfortable for a lot of people. When you ask and invite someone to come as they are, it can be uncomfortable if you haven't had a lot of interactions with people like this before, whether that's someone who is, gender or sexuality diverse, or perhaps from a different culture or different ability. But it's really important that we don't put up the barriers to protect ourselves in that, but actually allow, as those hosting, allow ourselves to sit in the uncomfortableness so that the person we're sitting opposite can come fully whole and can come as their authentic self. And God will move in that space and lives will be transformed around the room. There's no doubt about it. But if it's uncomfortable for you to sit in a room with a gay person sharing their fears of an upcoming vote, if it's uncomfortable for you to share a toilet with someone who's same-sex attracted, if it's uncomfortable for you to worship next to someone who has someone of the same sex standing next to them, imagine how uncomfortable it is for that person to have come to that space, to have allowed themselves into hostile territory because they're seeking Jesus, they're seeking connection, they're seeking the Spirit, they're seeking community, they're seeking fellowship, they're seeking love. It's hard. So I know it's hard. I know it can be uncomfortable to welcome and include. It's not easy, but it's a lot easier than it is to actually present yourself and be vulnerable when you know what the risks could be. So it's a challenge, I guess. Let's all allow ourselves to be a little uncomfortable. As I said, I'm sure that God will move and lives will be transformed right across the board when we all do that.
100%. Kris, thank you so much for sharing with me today and for sharing with anyone who will engage with this video. I'm sure it will challenge people. It will make people feel angry and grief at what you've experienced. And I hope and pray that it will crack people open to be part of advocating for greater inclusion wherever they find themselves. And I know that, you know, I feel like I'm still constantly learning my blind spots, things I've participated in, whether consciously or unconsciously, that I need to, you know, reorient. And yeah, thank you for being someone who has helped to be part of that process for me. I don't take it for granted the fact that you would stay in spaces we were in together wasn't in vain, because you have changed things in my world and in my heart. So yeah, just really grateful, and continuing to pray for God's blessing on your ministry, and your passion for your calling is such a beautiful thing. And, you know, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Yeah.
Thanks, Will. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
Thanks, man.